You want to have someone in China who's a little bit antagonistic. It really helps the United States. It really helps the America First trade agenda. If you don't have that, you have somebody who looks like a Westerner, so to speak. And
you're listening to Kerry Lutz's Financial Survival Network, where you get valuable information you just can't find anywhere else. To thrive in today's trying times, you need the Financial Survival Network, now more than ever. Go to financialsurvivalnetwork.com and get your free newsletter and gift. Financial Survival Network, now more than ever.
And welcome. You are listening to and watching the Financial Survival Network. I'm your host, Kerry Lutz. Well, is the trade war with China, is it winding down or is it gearing up? Well, if you're curious, then you're definitely going to want to hear from my next guest, Kenneth Rapoza, and you find him at prosperousamerica.org. And Ken, it's great to have you back on the show. So, trade war with China, what's the status now?
Sure. Well, I like to call Trump the good cop and bad cop all rolled into one. So if you're trying to figure out the trade, I think the trade war is just heating up. But if you are a regular Joe who's not watching this all day long, you would hear on Monday Trump saying, we're going to hit China with 100% tariffs. They're withholding rare earth minerals from us and we need them. And that's not fair because they broke a promise. And that's that. And then Tuesday morning comes and Trump says, well, Xi Jinping was just having a bad day. All is well. We're all friends. So you just don't know where it's going. But from the closer look is that the United States is in an economic battle with China. And don't think of China as just one country. Think of China as the economic leader of a region. And that region is all of Asia. And that is a region that was heavily dominated for many years by the West, by U.S. multinationals, by some degree Japanese multinationals and South Korean multinationals. That is going by the wayside. The Chinese companies are no longer making Happy Meal toys and Nike shoes. They are making their own brands and they are competing directly with big American tech and big American multinational corporations, whether they're the equivalent of Amazon cloud service providers or whether they are the guys who are making cars, right? For example, Europe is worried about EVs coming in from China, and the EVs will absolutely outnumber European EVs on price alone. So it's a situation where the United States has to convince their multinationals to invest in the United States. And the only way to do that is to close the door as hard as you can and as tight as you can on China. And that means making China completely unattractive. And not only China, but the countries around it, including Southeast Asia, where Trump was just visiting those four countries, Malaysia, Cambodia, Thailand, Vietnam. And as you notice, despite the talk of trade deals, we still have the 20% tariff on all of those countries at a minimum. So, and that is because we cannot have American multinationals just setting up shop in Vietnam, where $1 goes a lot farther there than it does here, and shipping goods into the United States. That's just not good. That's going to defeat the purpose. So the battle continues, and they're trying to isolate China to the best of their ability. We'll see if they can succeed.
Yeah. So also, you had the issue of them transshipping through Vietnam and Thailand, all of that, and on the other hand, they're sharing the same hemisphere as China, the same area. So, how much can they really go against China? That's right. It's the question.
Well, yeah. And, in a lot of these countries like Vietnam and maybe Malaysia, I can't remember off the top of my head, but some of the big four, the old Asian tigers, their foreign direct investment mostly comes from China. The United States, of course, would be a close second, and in some cases, even number one. But China is very important to those economies. There's a lot of Chinese entrepreneurs, including expat Chinese, who fled because they're not exactly enamored with the CCP, and they have set up shop in Vietnam, and of course Singapore is crawling with Chinese. So these are areas that are very entwined with China. But the deals that came out of Southeast Asia over the last week have basically said that, okay, we're going to do this with you. Us Americans are going to do this deal with you guys. We're going to buy your rare earths or partner with you on these projects, but we're only going to do it insofar as you don't sign any big deal with the Chinese. And how long will that hold? Trump is only president for 3 more years. So we will see. It's very difficult for these countries down there to just turn around and say, in the us versus them world of the Trump administration, to say that we're not, we're going to more, we're going to work with you to help isolate China. What Trump really has to do is say to our multinationals, look, we know you love Asia and you've loved it for a very long time. And if it was up to you, you'd put all your money there. But we need to reverse that and put some of it here. Because if you don't, then the future century, yes, it's absolutely Asia, and there's no stopping it, and everybody knows it. So you had to put some sort of roadblocks up there, and that would be the tariffs and other ways to isolate China. And that's what the Trump administration is doing. They understand that China is the leader of, in a multipolar world, China is the leader of the other group. And the United States is the leader of the Western group. And so, and if it's not going to, and it's going to placate China and just let all our multinationals just offshore and invest there, then China really becomes a dominant force in Asia and continues to become a dominant force in American supply chains to our dismay, actually, in the years ahead.
Well, but China is not doing very well now, are they? Their real estate bust. Factories closing up left, right. They've got some seemingly very difficult problems, and those problems, the solutions to those problems and the causes are directly tied into the CCP, and they don't seem very intent on solving them, do they?
Well, I will tell you this, that the CCP must solve them, because the CCP only rules on the notion that it can provide upward mobility to the people. And there are more non-CCP people who are apolitical Chinese than there are members of the CCP. And when they're mad, they will rise up. We saw it, of course, in the 80s in Tiananmen Square, and we saw it recently during COVID with the white paper protests. When the Chinese people are pushed to the wall, they will rise up. And they don't rise up often because their lives have been improving for at least a generation now. If that changes, then I expect China will see more civil unrest. All right.
Correct.
But what's happening in China now with real estate is, that's a domestic policy issue where a lot of Chinese people are not really allowed to invest overseas, right? The Chinese stock market is really a gambling den. If you look at like the Shanghai Exchange, you see a bunch of old guys there. It looks like you're walking into Foxwoods Casino or Bellagio or something like that. They're all sitting there at a table. So it's more of a gambling den for them. They cannot invest in Apple or Nike in the U.S., which they would see as something more secure. But they're not allowed to take their money out, so they put their money in real estate. So that's the reason one of the reasons for the real estate crisis. Of course, is it's a place where most Chinese are investing money, buying second and third homes. On the other front is that the trade war is really hitting China because, again, when you are decoupling from China or de-risking from China, as some of our multinationals would prefer to call it, you are taking away a lot of manufacturing power from the Chinese. That doesn't mean that Chinese multinationals aren't doing well because they have factories in Southeast Asia and Mexico, right? But it does mean that Chinese labor is not doing well because those people are losing their jobs. And so this is a big problem for China. China is in a sense going through what a lot of middle America went through when outsourcing began in earnest after the Cold War, when American corporations no longer needed to placate labor because they didn't have to, keep labor happy lest labor decide they want to become, they want us to follow the Soviet model, right? That model's dead. So now, corporations didn't really have to worry about what labor thought anymore. Globalization, the end of history, right? We all know what that led to. So China is dealing with that now in a sense. And the trade war is really a 1-2 punch to the labor markets where they're dealing with a lot of outsourcing. And that's a big headwind for Chinese labor.
A lot of what's perceived in the West to be dramatic Chinese progress has turned out to really be a lot of smoke and mirrors, hasn't it?
Well, look, I've been to China, so I've seen some of the smoke and mirrors myself. I've seen the ghost cities. I've seen the 3-lane roads with no one in them. I've seen, small factories or office towers with, no one in them. It was almost like I was on the Truman Show. But on the other hand, even though I saw that when I was in Beijing or when I was in other cities like Chengdu, which is a big tech city, as much as it was still very much a developing country, especially in Chengdu, it looked very much like towns and areas I would see in Brazil, poor, right?
Mhm.
But in Beijing, rich, trains, clean, right? High tech, fast, safe, right? Compared to areas in Philly or areas in New York, for example, it would look very much like a first world. So, there are many things of China that are, on par with or better than what we have in the United States. But because it's such a huge country, it still has a lot of that developing country, or what the old third world, what we used to say back in the 80s. That still very much exists in China. I know a lot of people in the West like to say, China's not a developing country anymore. Look at them, and it's true, but they're only looking at the Beijing and Shanghai girls with the legit Michael Kors handbags, and they're not looking at the guys who live in villages and pick apples for a living. You know what I mean? And those people exist, and they exist by the hundreds of thousands, right? So, China, and having said that, Kerry, this is why China can't afford to have manufacturing go overseas, meaning to Southeast Asia, because they lose that blue collar labor. They lose that social contract that they had with the Chinese plebs. And that's a big problem for the CCP. Probably bigger than a crashing real estate market.
Yeah, well, they've kind of breached the agreement with their people, which was, hey, we'll provide you prosperity, economic success, and in exchange, you just ignore everything political, behave yourselves, and don't cause any trouble. And we're kind of seeing like the end of that social compact, the erosion of it, basically the dissolution of it, right?
Well, yeah. If the trade war keeps up, and I expect it to, then that will continue to happen. I don't see, what does China do there are whole companies in China that just exist to serve the Western market. Look at companies like Shein and Temu. You think Chinese are buying Shein and Temu clothes? Probably not. I mean, that's a company that is designed to make goods for the U.S. And these are people who, in Shein, we think of Shein as a big corporation, a big brand. Now they got stores in Europe. But again, these are the clothes that they sell on Shein and the products they sell on Temu. They're made by, small businesses that probably have stitch and sew factories in their basement, and the 14-year-old girl is, happily making a baby dress, right, for free, because it's her mom's stitch and sew factory with her and the aunt, right? And they're selling it to you that's why they could sell it to you for $5, because the little girl making the dress is making $0. And I'm not saying that's all of Shein, that's all of Temu, but this is a lot of Chinese labor. That a lot of Chinese labor is geared towards making things for the West and making things for export. And when that market closes up, where do they go? We don't know where they're going. We don't have a lot of data on that on China. A lot of them are still making stuff, and they're dumping it in Europe, and they're dumping it maybe in Brazil or in Mexico, and those countries will eventually have to come to terms with that. But that is a huge problem for China, again, as I said, because, and as you said, once that social pact erodes, then the CCP has a problem, and then you could even see shakeup in the worst case scenario for Xi Jinping. You could even see a shakeup in the hierarchy of CCP and who leads.
Yeah, and that's the end result, isn't it? Basically, maybe we're not actively going for a regime change, but
right.
That is kind of the inevitability, isn't it? Because, and one thing I want to address is tofu dreg construction. It's rampant, and it's demonstrative of the extent of the corruption in China, where these new projects, super projects, they're basically, they're like falling apart before their very eyes.
Yeah, some of the projects we've seen that they do fall apart. A lot of this is provincial governments, right? That think of China as everything is really about the labor market. China is mostly concerned with the labor force. Again, keeping in mind that upward mobility, that promise, that social contract with the CCP, with the rest of the Chinese, the Lao Beijing, as they're called, right? Old 100 names, is key to the CCP survival. Okay. If they cannot deliver on that, the CCP is in huge trouble, and the Chinese will uprise. Okay. Now, if those people are losing jobs, and I think that they are, where do they go? We don't know. This is all kind of new now. But what will the upper echelons of the CCP say? Will they say it's time for Xi Jinping to step down? Who would replace him? As he was saying before the taping, would it be some guy who looks more like a pro-Western type guy? And I will say that, and I say this all the time, that Xi Jinping is a godsend to the West, especially the United States, because if you had a pro-Western, let's let bygones be bygones Chinese leader, you think all these restrictions on what kind of tech you can sell China would still exist, or would they be lifted? They'll be lifted. You think a lot of these higher tariffs that China faces versus its neighbors in Southeast Asia, would they be equalized? I'm not saying tariffs would come off like pre-2017 Trump, but maybe they would go to Vietnam levels at 20%. That would probably happen. That would be an equalizer for China. And then all of a sudden, all the multinationals that are rethinking about maybe moving to Mexico or setting up, expanding capacity at their factories in the United States, maybe they decide, hey, you know what? Making that Lincoln Continental was a good idea in China after all. Keeping that Buick export, because that's what was happening. We were making cars. Ford and GM were making cars in Asia, in South Korea, and China for export to the United States. It's bad enough we got a neighbor right next door at free trade. We can easily do it there. But over time, you would just, why would you make anything in the U.S. unless it was literally too big to ship? So, you want to have someone in China who's a little bit antagonistic. It really helps the United States. It really helps the America First trade agenda. If you don't have that, you have somebody who looks like a Westerner, so to speak, in terms of, very liberal, and who knows, maybe they have Pride Month going on in Shanghai. Then it's all over. You'll just have the multinationals, let bygones be bygones, as I said, and you go back to pre-2017 relations with China, which would be, I think, a huge headwind for a lot of industry in the United States, especially industry that has invested here over the last few years.
Agreed. All right. So when we have this conversation in 6 months, where do you think we'll be, Kenneth?
That's a good question. I think that in 6 months, we are in the same situation with China. I think 6 months we will know more about how tariffs have impacted inflation and cost of living, which is very important and top of mind for the United States. And you're going to have midterms. So that's going to take over a lot of the topic and supersede the America First agenda. So what Trump needs to do and what we need to see is that the tariff policy, of which China is paramount, is increasing manufacturing labor, blue-collar labor. Wages are rising. And even if inflation is going up 3%, whatever, that the cost of living, even if it's rising, Americans can handle it.
Right.
Because if your beef is costing $12 a pound, right, from $7 a pound today, and I'm getting laid off, even if the beef is still duty-free from Mexico, the average Joe is not going to think that.
Yeah.
They're gonna hear whatever they hear in the New York Times or CNBC or CNN or whatever, or Facebook, telling us it's all because of tariffs. It's all Trump's fault.
Yeah.
And then that's going to sour things, and that could sour things on. I don't think it will sour things on China. I think China, the China's at best you get a stalemate, right, with China.
Yeah.
But I think it could easily sour things on tariffs in Southeast Asia and elsewhere. So, and that could be a problem, because now you don't have a signal that says, okay, I invested $10 million in expanding this factory, right? The GM factory, let's say, in Indiana, to make more cars here than I do in Mexico. Why did I do that? What was the point? So those are the guys you have to entice. You have to convince them that Trump's trade policy is working. And China is the main narrative there. If you go soft on China, then you obviously go soft on the rest of Asia. And then people who are saying, "Yeah, I'm going to invest in the United States," that's like, why am I doing that?
I'm going to bother.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Why did I bother?
Exactly.
All right, Ken. Well, really fascinating. And I guess we're going to sit back and see. I don't think I think Trump bluffs a lot. I think he's a really good poker player, but I think he's holding a lot of good cards here. So I just don't think that's going to happen. But hey, I've been wrong before.
Yeah.
And it's going to be interesting to find out. Hey, just tell us, where do we find you? How do we connect with you on the web?
Sure. So you find me at the Coalition for a Prosperous America, which is an advocacy group for American producers, whether they're beef ranchers or solar manufacturers. We want you guys to be making things in the United States, and we are at prosperousamerica.org. Or you can find me on X at my old Forbes handle, which would be Brick Breaker. I'm not for everybody on X, though, Kerry.
Hey, who do you think you're talking to here? I'm everybody either. Believe you me, that just ain't the case. But hey, appreciate you coming on. Questions, comments for Ken, myself, KL@KerryLutz.com. You can also find all of my work. It's on Substack now, KerryLutz.com. Take you right there. FinancialSurvivalNetwork.com, same deal. Ken, appreciate you coming on, and we will talk to you again soon.
My pleasure. Thank you. Have a good day.
Thanks for listening to Kerry Lutz's Financial Survival Network, your solution to today's trying times. For the latest, go to FinancialSurvivalNetwork.com. Financial Survival Network, now more than ever.